Racist cop attacks black woman in court. Sirens interrupt the trial. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Angela Brooks stood quietly near the wooden railing of the courtroom, her hands resting calmly at her sides, as if the weight of the room had no claim over her. The courthouse in downtown was built decades ago, its high ceilings and pale stone walls designed to project authority, order, and fairness. Yet the air that morning felt heavy and unwelcoming. Rows of benches creaked as spectators shifted, their whispers blending with the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Angela's posture remained steady, her face composed, her eyes forward, refusing to shrink beneath the stares that followed her every movement. Officer Daniel Wright, assigned to courtroom security, watched her with visible irritation. He stood tall in his pressed uniform, boots aligned perfectly with the tiled floor, projecting confidence shaped by years of unquestioned authority. To him, the courtroom was familiar ground, a place where his voice carried weight and compliance was expected without explanation. When Angela stepped slightly out of line to adjust her position, his reaction came swiftly and publicly, his tone sharp enough to slice through the murmurs in the room. The judge paused, the gavel hovering above the bench, while the gallery froze, unsure whether to look away or lean in. Angela did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She did not plead. Instead, she turned slowly, meeting Daniel's glare with a calm that unsettled him more than any protest could have. The moment stretched, thick with tension, as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath. The contrast was unmistakable. A man certain of his control, confronting a woman who refused to surrender her dignity. Around them, legal professionals exchanged uneasy glances. This was supposed to be a space governed by rules, by restraint, by fairness. Yet something fundamental was slipping. Daniel took another step, convinced that the room would back him, that the badge on his chest would speak louder than any truth Angela carried. Still, she remained silent, her composure unbroken, her gaze steady, as though she understood something the rest of the room did not. Outside, traffic moved along the avenue, the distant sound of engines seeping faintly through the courthouse walls. Inside, the imbalance of power was on full display, and everyone could feel it. Angela's stillness became its own statement, a quiet resistance that contrasted sharply with Daniel's escalating frustration. He believed the moment belonged to him, that the structure of the courtroom would protect his assumptions and justify his actions. What he could not sense yet was the shift already underway, subtle but irreversible. The tension in the room was no longer centered on Angela's presence, but on his reaction to it. As seconds passed, the atmosphere changed, as if the truth was drawing closer, unseen but unavoidable. No one spoke. No one intervened. And in that charged silence, with authority exposed and dignity standing firm, the stage was set for a reckoning that would arrive not through force, but through revelation. The courtroom settled into a strained stillness after the exchange, as if the building itself sensed the imbalance that had just revealed itself. Angela Brooks returned to her place near the railing, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, while the quiet hum of the room resumed in uneven waves. The judge cleared his throat and attempted to restore order, tapping the gavel lightly, though the sound felt more symbolic than commanding. Papers rustled. A clerk adjusted her chair, and a ceiling fan rotated slowly above, pushing stale air across the polished wooden surfaces. Angela's presence seemed to draw attention without effort, not because she demanded it, but because she refused to dissolve into the background the way so many expected her to. She stood as if she had every right to be there, as if the courtroom was not an arena of intimidation, but a space she understood deeply. Officer Daniel Wright remained nearby, his posture rigid, eyes tracking her movements with a mixture of irritation and unease. He told himself that he was simply enforcing order, that discipline required firmness, yet something about Angela's silence unsettled him. It was not fear he saw in her face, nor defiance in the way he recognized it. It was patience, deliberate and composed, the kind that suggested awareness rather than submission. Around them, spectators shifted on the hard benches, some pretending to review their phones, others watching openly, sensing that something meaningful was unfolding even if they could not name it yet. The courtroom, meant to represent balance and fairness, felt increasingly lopsided, tilted by assumptions that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Angela's eyes briefly scanned the room, taking in the judge, the clerk, the attorneys seated at their tables, and finally the sealed wooden doors at the far end of the chamber. Her gaze lingered there just long enough to suggest expectation, not hope, but certainty. Daniel noticed the look and frowned, misinterpreting it as distraction or reluctance to comply. He shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt creaking softly, a small sound that echoed louder than it should have in the tense quiet. He believed authority was something worn, displayed, enforced through presence. Angela understood it differently. To her, authority was not volume or posture, but timing, and the ability to remain grounded while others exposed themselves through impatience. The judge resumed speaking, addressing procedural matters, yet his words floated above the room without anchoring themselves. No one was fully listening. The energy had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, and even those unfamiliar with courtrooms could feel it pressing against their senses. Outside, beyond the thick stone walls, the city continued its routine rhythm. Cars moving through intersections, pedestrians crossing streets, unaware that inside this building, a quiet test of power was unfolding. Angela remained still, her hands relaxed, her shoulders squared, carrying herself with a calm that suggested preparation rather than reaction. Daniel, on the other hand, felt the unfamiliar tightening in his chest that came when control was no longer absolute. He glanced toward the entrance again, then back at Angela, as if searching for reassurance in familiar symbols. The courtroom lights flickered briefly, barely noticeable, yet enough to heighten the sense that something was approaching. In that moment, before any interruption arrived, before any truth was spoken aloud, the roles in the room were already beginning to shift. Angela did not move. She did not need to. Time itself seemed to lean in her direction, aligning quietly, waiting for the exact second when silence would give way to revelation. Angela Brooks had learned long ago how to exist in rooms that were not built with her in mind. As the judge continued with procedural remarks, her attention drifted inward, not as an escape, but as a grounding. She stood where she was, aware of the polished wood beneath her shoes and the faint smell of old paper and furniture polish that lingered in the air. The courtroom was familiar in a way that surprised people who assumed otherwise. She had spent years walking through places like this, not always as a participant, sometimes as an observer, sometimes as a name on a list that never made it to the public record. Her calm was not accidental. It was practiced. Officer Daniel Wright remained within a few feet of her, his presence heavy, his gaze sharp, yet his certainty was beginning to fray. He could feel eyes on him now, subtle but present, and he did not like it. Authority, he believed, thrived on unquestioned acceptance, and the longer Angela stood without reacting, the more that belief felt challenged. The courtroom clerk called out the next item on the docket, her voice measured and professional, but even she seemed aware that the rhythm of the room had changed. Angela listened, nodding slightly, acknowledging the process without surrendering herself to it. She was not there to disrupt the system, but she was not there to be diminished by it either. Her thoughts returned briefly to the path that had brought her to this moment, to the countless hours spent preparing for rooms exactly like this one, where assumptions could be as dangerous as any spoken accusation. She knew how people like Daniel saw her, how quickly conclusions were drawn based on appearance alone. She also knew how fragile those conclusions became when confronted with patience and timing. Daniel shifted again, adjusting his stance, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the judge and then back to Angela. He told himself that everything was under control, that nothing unexpected ever truly happened in his courtroom. Yet there was an unfamiliar sensation pressing at the edges of his confidence, a quiet awareness that the narrative he relied on was no longer entirely his to command. Around them, the audience leaned forward almost imperceptibly. A woman in the back row folded her arms. A man near the aisle lowered his phone, and an attorney paused mid-note, sensing that the moment demanded attention. Angela's eyes lifted once more toward the courtroom doors, her expression unchanged, but her focus precise. She was not waiting for permission. She was waiting for alignment. The building seemed to echo with restrained anticipation, every sound slightly amplified, from the shuffle of papers to the distant murmur of traffic outside. Daniel noticed the way the room responded to her stillness and felt irritation give way to something closer to uncertainty. He had mistaken silence for weakness before, but this silence carried weight. It suggested preparation, not fear. The judge glanced up from the bench, his eyes moving between the officer and the woman before him, sensing that the authority of his gavel alone might not be enough to contain what was unfolding. Angela remained composed, her presence steady, her resolve quiet but unmistakable. She did not need to announce who she was or why she stood there. That truth had its own momentum, moving steadily closer, second by second, toward a moment that would redefine the balance of the room. And as the air grew heavier with expectation, it became clear that the courtroom was no longer merely a place of judgment, but a stage where assumptions were about to meet something far more enduring. The tension that had been simmering now pressed closer to the surface, stretching the courtroom's composure thin. Officer Daniel Wright took a slow breath, steadying himself, then spoke again with a firmness that carried more edge than authority. His words were framed as instruction, but the undertone was unmistakable, shaped by assumption rather than fact. Angela Brooks listened without interruption, her face composed, her posture unchanged, as if she were allowing the moment to reveal more about him than about herself. The judge shifted in his seat, clearly aware that the balance of the room was beginning to tilt, yet hesitant to intervene decisively. Procedure continued on paper, but emotionally the room had moved somewhere else entirely. Angela's silence no longer felt passive to those watching. It felt intentional. Daniel paced a few steps, stopping just short of the boundary that separated order from overreach, convinced that asserting control would reestablish the hierarchy he relied on. He believed the courtroom would validate him. That structure itself would reinforce his stance. Instead, he felt the opposite. Eyes followed his movement, and the subtle weight of scrutiny settled on his shoulders. Angela remained still, her gaze level, her attention fixed not on him, but on the broader space around them, as if she understood the full scope of what was unfolding. The murmurs in the gallery grew slightly louder, then fell quiet again, a collective awareness forming without instruction. An attorney at one of the tables closed a folder slowly, sensing that the exchange had become something more than routine. Daniel's frustration sharpened as he noticed how the room responded to Angela's restraint. He interpreted it as defiance, unaware that the very thing unsettling him was her refusal to perform the role he had assigned her. She did not appear intimidated. She did not appear apologetic. She appeared present. The judge finally raised his hand, signaling for calm, his voice measured as he reminded everyone of decorum. The reminder landed unevenly, restoring formality, but not erasing what had already been exposed. Angela acknowledged the instruction with a slight nod, neither submissive nor confrontational, simply respectful of the process. Daniel, however, felt the moment slipping from his grasp. The confidence he had carried into the room now required effort to maintain. He adjusted his uniform, squared his shoulders, and glanced once more toward the doors, then back to Angela, as if searching for confirmation that he was still in control. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, unaware that inside this courthouse, assumptions were unraveling quietly. The courtroom lights hummed softly, casting even illumination across faces that now held a mixture of curiosity and concern. Angela's calm had become a mirror, reflecting the tension back onto the system itself. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. Yet her presence challenged the room more effectively than any argument could have. Daniel's words grew sharper, his patience thinner, revealing the strain beneath his authority. Each sentence he spoke seemed to tighten the atmosphere rather than restore order. Angela remained centered, her breathing steady, her focus unwavering. She understood that escalation did not always require volume, that sometimes it unfolded through contrast alone. The judge's gavel tapped again, louder this time, attempting to pull the room back into alignment. But the moment had already shifted. What was once a simple exercise of authority had become a quiet examination of it. And as the tension reached its peak, the sense that something external was drawing near became undeniable, as if the courtroom itself were preparing for an interruption that would redefine everything that had just transpired. The courtroom hovered in a fragile equilibrium, the kind that felt stable only because no one dared disturb it. Angela Brooks sensed the shift before anyone else acknowledged it. It was not a sound or a movement, but a subtle tightening in the air, the awareness that the moment had reached a threshold beyond which it could not remain unchanged. She adjusted her stance slightly, a controlled movement that drew no attention, and let her gaze settle forward once more. Officer Daniel Wright continued to stand nearby, his authority now maintained through effort rather than certainty. He spoke again, choosing words carefully, attempting to reclaim the room through procedure, but each sentence seemed to expose the strain beneath his composure. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, yet his eyes betrayed hesitation, as though he sensed that formalities alone would not restore balance. Angela's silence had become a presence of its own, shaping the room in ways no directive could. Those watching began to recognize the contrast unfolding before them, not through spectacle, but through restraint. An older man in the front row leaned back, folding his hands, while a young clerk paused mid-motion, her pen hovering above the page. The courtroom, once predictable, now felt suspended between what it was and what it was about to become. Angela's thoughts remained focused, not on defense or explanation, but on timing. She had learned that truth revealed itself best when allowed to arrive naturally, without force or urgency. Daniel, however, felt urgency creeping in despite himself. He glanced again toward the entrance, an instinctive movement he did not fully understand, as though some part of him anticipated interruption. The judge cleared his throat and announced a brief pause in the proceedings, a procedural decision meant to ease tension, yet only deepened the sense that something larger was approaching. Angela welcomed the pause, using the moment to observe the room with quiet clarity. She noted the way attention shifted toward her without her asking for it, the way authority subtly began to redistribute itself. Daniel stood rigid, his earlier confidence now tempered by awareness. He was no longer certain how the room would respond if he pressed further. Outside the courthouse walls, the city's rhythm pressed closer, distant sounds filtering faintly through stone and glass, unnoticed by most, but not by Angela. She recognized the pattern, the alignment of events that often preceded revelation. Her calm was not detachment. It was readiness. The judge conferred briefly with the clerk, voices low, while attorneys remained seated, their usual urgency replaced by watchful silence. Angela remained exactly where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, embodying a stillness that seemed to anchor the room. Daniel shifted again, attempting to mask his unease with routine gestures, but the effort only highlighted the change in dynamic. The courtroom lights cast steady illumination, revealing expressions that had grown thoughtful, even questioning. This was no longer a simple matter of compliance or control. It had become an examination of assumptions, unfolding quietly in plain sight. Angela's gaze returned briefly to the doors, not with anticipation that bordered on hope, but with certainty grounded in preparation. She understood that the truth did not need her to announce it. It only required the right moment to enter the room. As the pause stretched on, the silence grew heavier, charged with expectation. The judge straightened in his seat, preparing to resume, unaware that the next moments would not follow the script he expected. Daniel inhaled slowly, bracing himself for a continuation he believed he could still manage. Angela remained composed, her presence steady, her resolve unspoken. And in that suspended instant, before any external signal announced itself, the courtroom stood on the edge of transformation, poised to learn whether authority would hold or whether it would finally be required to answer to something greater. The stillness in the courtroom had reached a point where even the smallest movements seemed to carry weight. Angela Brooks stood exactly where she had been, her posture upright, her expression unchanged, her presence quietly commanding the space around her. Daniel Wright, once certain of his authority, now found himself battling an unsettling awareness that the control he had always taken for granted was slipping, piece by piece, beneath the weight of Angela's calm composure. He glanced toward the judge, expecting to find reassurance in the eyes of someone who, by position, should maintain order, but the judge merely sat there, his face unreadable. The room had grown heavier, thick with an unspoken tension that none of the formalities seemed able to disperse. The usual rhythms of the courtroom were gone, replaced by the subtle but undeniable feeling that something else was at play, something that was beyond the reach of mere procedure. Angela's stillness had become a force in itself, not through volume or display, but through quiet resistance, the kind that does not demand acknowledgement but commands respect. Officer Wright shifted on his feet, his fingers twitching at his belt, his eyes darting back to Angela. There was no more confidence in his posture. The certainty that had guided his movements earlier now seemed hollow, replaced with a creeping doubt that threatened to break his focus. The courtroom seemed to sense it too, as if every person present was waiting for something, anything, to break the silence, to return the room to its expected order. But Angela did not move, did not speak. She was no longer just a participant in this moment. She had become a mirror to the system, reflecting the quiet tension, the assumptions, the expectations of those who had been too quick to judge her. The pause stretched long, so long that the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable shift. Outside the courthouse, the city moved on, unaware of the stillness inside. But here, within these walls, the fight was taking shape, not in words, but in the weight of presence, in the quiet assertion of one individual standing firm. The judge's gavel tapped softly, a signal that the proceedings would resume, but the sound was distant, faint, as though it were coming from another world. No one in the room moved immediately, as if each person was caught in the gravity of the moment. It was only when the judge spoke again, his voice slightly strained, that anyone dared to break the silence. His words were aimed at Angela, asking her to explain herself, to provide some clarity, but his tone lacked conviction. It was not the voice of authority, but of someone who had been unsure for too long, trying to reassert control that had already begun to slip through his fingers. Angela turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were calm, her expression unreadable, but in that moment, everything seemed to shift. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension peaking as everyone awaited her response. But instead of an answer, there was only silence, the weight of her gaze speaking volumes. The judge faltered for a moment, unsure what to say next. And in that brief silence, Angela's unspoken truth filled the room. She did not need to explain herself, for she already knew that. The truth had begun to reveal itself, and there was nothing that could stop it now. The room seemed to hold its breath in that fleeting moment, a collective pause that stretched uncomfortably long. Angela Brooks continued to stand as she had been, unmoving, but the shift that had begun was now undeniable. Officer Daniel Wright's eyes flickered from Angela to the judge, his uncertainty beginning to manifest in subtle ways. Tightened shoulders, the slight twitch of his hands at his sides. He had always operated in spaces where his presence dictated control, where his actions were unquestioned, but now, in the weight of Angela's silence, that control felt like an illusion. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes still locked on Angela, but it was clear now that his authority was no longer absolute. He had tried to reassert himself, tried to guide the room back to its previous order, but something had shifted, something that had nothing to do with his gavel. Angela had not said a word, but her stillness had exposed the frailty of the power that had once governed this space. It was in the way the gallery shifted in their seats, the way they observed the unfolding moment with more intensity, sensing that they were witnessing something far beyond routine. The tension that had filled the air seemed to have a life of its own now, like an unseen force pulling the room toward a revelation. The judge hesitated, his gavel resting in his hand, as if searching for the words to guide the room back into structure. Yet, despite his position, despite the authority he was meant to wield, Angela's quiet presence had already begun to reshape the space around her. She had not demanded attention. She had not raised her voice. She had simply stood her ground, and in doing so, had redefined the power dynamic in the room. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, and in that moment, the judge realized that it was not his gavel that held the room together, but the subtle, undeniable force of truth that Angela had brought into the light. It was a quiet force, not the kind that shouted for attention, but the kind that could not be ignored. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice softer now, less certain, but still trying to anchor the proceedings. "Is there anything you wish to add, Ms. Brooks?" he asked, but the weight of the question seemed to carry more than just procedural formality. It was a question that now demanded an answer not just from Angela, but from the system itself. Angela met the judge's gaze, her eyes steady and calm. She did not need to speak in that moment. Her silence was her answer. The room seemed to understand this without needing further explanation. Angela knew that in that moment, everything had already shifted. She had not needed to fight. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had simply been present, and that presence had become the force that upended everything. The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers nervously tapping the surface of the bench, as if he too was waiting for the next moment to arrive. Outside, the world continued as usual, unaware of the quiet storm that had just passed through the courtroom. But inside, the air felt different. The balance of power had been altered, and no one, not even the judge, could deny that what had just unfolded would have consequences far beyond these walls. The silence stretched, an invisible weight that pressed down on every person in the room. Angela stood, unwavering, while Officer Daniel Wright shifted uneasily on his feet. His previously solid stance had crumbled, and now, with every passing second, the tension seemed to compound. His eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, first to the judge, then to the spectators, who watched with increasing interest. He could feel their eyes on him, a silent judgment that he had never had to face before. The calmness of Angela's presence in contrast to his own discomfort unsettled him further. The judge, once certain of his role as the final authority, seemed to falter. He cleared his throat, his voice no longer the commanding presence it had once been. "I believe we are at a crossroads," he said, his tone lacking the sharpness it usually carried. His gaze moved toward Angela, a moment of realization crossing his face. It was clear now, though he had not articulated it to himself, that this was no longer about enforcing procedure. This was about something deeper, something that no ruling or gavel could easily dictate. Angela, however, remained unmoved. She did not react to the judge's words, nor did she look to Daniel for any kind of response. Her focus remained forward, as though the true resolution of the moment had already arrived, not through words, but through the calm determination of her stance. Daniel, feeling his control slipping away, finally took a step forward, his voice a bit shakier now. "Ms. Brooks, you do not belong here." "You," he trailed off, unsure of what to say next, as his own doubts began to cloud his judgment. Angela turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. There was no fire in her eyes, no anger or aggression, just an unwavering, calm certainty that seemed to hold him in place. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. The weight of his words hung in the air, but Angela did not allow them to reach her. Her presence was a silent answer, a quiet declaration that needed no defense. The judge, sensing the shift, finally spoke, though his voice wavered as he did. "Officer Wright, I believe we've reached the limit of this exchange. This is a matter that requires careful consideration, and I will not allow it to continue down this path." The finality in his words, though soft, carried the weight of a decision that had been long coming. Daniel's face flushed, and for a moment, it looked as if he might protest further, but something held him back. Angela's calmness had unnerved him in a way he hadn't anticipated, and now, with the judge's words, he realized that the power dynamic in the room had shifted. The door behind them opened just slightly, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. The interruption was not loud, but it was enough. Angela's eyes flicked briefly to the door, a subtle acknowledgement that the world outside was still turning, still unaware of the quiet battle that had unfolded within these walls. And in that moment, the true weight of her calm resolve became clear. She had not needed to speak. She had not needed to assert herself aggressively. Her stillness alone had disrupted the room, had dismantled the sense of control that Daniel and the system had relied on for so long. The tension in the room seemed to dissolve, not with the force of an argument or the slam of a gavel, but with the quiet strength of one person standing firm. As the judge signaled for the proceedings to resume, there was no mistaking the shift that had occurred. The room, once governed by assumptions and routines, was now forever altered by the simple, unwavering presence of Angela Brooks. The room was filled with a quiet sense of resolution as the proceedings began to shift, slowly but unmistakably, in favor of something more than just the written law. Angela Brooks stood there, unmoving, her presence still as powerful as ever, yet her calmness seemed to envelop the room like a shield. The tension that had held the room in a vice-like grip began to recede, replaced by an unexpected silence that only deepened the weight of the moment. Daniel Wright, who had once commanded the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, was now visibly disoriented. His eyes flickered toward the judge, seeking a semblance of reassurance, but the judge's expression remained unreadable. The judge had spoken, but his words were no longer the final ruling of the room. They were a concession, an acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. Angela had not raised her voice, had not fought back with words, but she had altered the very fabric of the room's energy. The stillness was not one of submission, but of quiet strength, a force that slowly made itself known in ways words could never achieve. Angela's gaze never wavered from the judge, though her thoughts were far from here. She had come to understand that moments like this were never truly about confrontation. They were about presence. Her stillness was her voice. Her refusal to be diminished was her power. Daniel, however, was beginning to feel the weight of the loss he had not expected. He had thought himself in control, but now, standing in the same room as Angela, he understood just how fragile that control had always been. His eyes flickered briefly to the clock on the wall, but the ticking seconds seemed to mock him now. The room was still, but it was no longer neutral. It was alive with the subtle hum of an unseen shift in power. The judge, sensing the change, finally adjusted his position. He cleared his throat again, though it felt less like an attempt to regain control, and more like a pause before an inevitable change. "I think it's time we moved forward," the judge said, his voice now tentative. "Ms. Brooks, please," he trailed off, the sentence unfinished, his gaze dropping to the paperwork in front of him. Angela did not immediately respond. She didn't need to. Her silence had already spoken louder than any words could. It was a deliberate pause, a moment of stillness that spoke of waiting, not for permission but for alignment. The room felt the shift once again, like a tide rolling in quietly but steadily. Angela's calmness had become the axis around which everything in the room now seemed to pivot. Even the judge, who had attempted to steer the proceedings back into familiar waters, could feel the momentum slipping away from him. The room was no longer his to control. Angela's stillness had spoken for her, and now, for the first time, the people in the room were forced to reckon with their own roles in the dynamic. They could no longer ignore the truth that had been revealed, that authority was not defined by volume or by badges, but by the quiet assertion of one's place in the world. Daniel could feel his grip on the situation slipping further as the judge, in a moment of rare clarity, nodded as if in acknowledgement. There was nothing more to say. The moment had already been decided, not by gavel or by force, but by Angela's quiet, unyielding presence. The judge paused, then turned to the others in the room, signaling that the next steps could proceed. The courtroom, once governed by a predictable flow, had been irrevocably altered. Angela's calm was not just the answer to the conflict in the room. It was the force that had unraveled it. As the proceedings continued, everyone in the room knew that nothing would be the same again. The system had been challenged, not by a loud protest or by resistance, but by the quiet strength of one person standing firmly in their truth.